For a hypothetical Elon Musk on steroids character, in team opening government, we think the far preferable choice for this individual is to take the alien up on his or her or its offer and travel to the different galaxy. For maybe perhaps 5, if I get lucky, ideas as to why this must be true on principles and practical levels. Before that, a few stipulations to establish. The first, let's recognize the dichotomy of the choice here. The Elon Musk character can either choose to stay or leave. In choosing to leave, the Elon Musk character will for sure save himself from near certain death, and for sure go on to help a different alien species and do science there. The other side of the dichotomy is in staying, not only will that character have near certain death, but dismal chances of saving the rest of the world from a similar catastrophic death, which presumably is terribly painful or instant. However, in opening government will say, even if the chance was fair or less dismal and the emotion makes it seem, the Elon Musk character, we'll call him Elon from now on, owes no obligation to this society and owes no duty of care to protect that society regardless of the chances, and rather that individuals' ownership of themselves and their ideas must take precedence. So, first substantive. Ownership of ideas. We argue that no society or group of peoples has ownership of an idea over that individual themselves. Recognize then that the value that this character has to the rest of society is premised perhaps solely, unless he has dashing good looks and does advertisement, premised solely on that individual's ideas, on the potential of that individual's ideas to be mechanized into good, whether in technology or whether in social systems, whatever as the motion describes. Now, recognize that no one owns his ideas beyond that individual themselves. The obvious analogous principle here is that we apply universally in IP laws across the developed world. In IP laws or intellectual property laws, we recognize that people have full rights to what they come up with in their minds as much as they have rights to their property, and they can do with the ideas what they would in any sort of transformation. That means an individual under this scheme has the right to pull their rights out of the public the moment they feel like those rights no longer have to be in the public. The obvious case here is Wilhelm Reich, the eminent psychologist that was a compatriot of Freud's during the McCarthy era, happily called back all of his books on the bioorgone because he felt like he no longer wanted the information out in the public sphere. We recognize that person's right to do that. Tell me why that's no longer the case. But not only about pulling it out of the public, an individual also has the right to move their ideas between private entities to other private entities. So a person working for one company can decide to retract all of the ideas and the ownership of the ideas to another. We recognize this under the current IP law scheme. Have a seat. And on this side of the house, you must argue why those things don't hold up anymore in the face of a crisis when they always have. Recognize though, the very existence of IP laws and the respect of a person's ownership of them is what guarantees that those people will generate ideas in the first place, so justify why we should scrap them. Second idea, the rights to individuals to own themselves. Now this is an extension of the first principle. Not only do you have a right to your mind, you have a right to everything else that's not your mind. Let's get Socratic and talk about your soul. We think individuals have a right to own their entire body and soul, if such a thing exists. This, I think, is an intuitive idea that everybody is has an inalienable right to avoid harm and save themselves from sudden death. You would never ask a person to do this. Now, in what instances would you have a duty of care to other people? We offer 3 criteria that we don't think are met here. The central trust we might get from opposition, we might expect, presumably, is that this person, because of their great capacity of intellect, owes a duty of care. Let's tell you the criteria of duty of care and why they don't meet and pale in the comparison to that right of the individual to save themselves. The first is capacity. If you were not a fireman or a firewoman and didn't have the technical ability to go into a burning building, you would never by law have like act of omission charged against you. You would never have a duty of care to go into a burning building because oftentimes you recognize more harm could be done or you yourself should not come to harm. So given that this person doesn't have the capacity to manifestly stop the meteor, he should not be required to. Remember that this person's ability to stop the meteor is not caveated or stipulated in the motion at all. So we would argue that the person has no capacity. Secondly, it's premised upon having no risk to yourself. Unlike soldiers and firemen who opt into this risk, this person never consented to any sort of risk being taken on to themselves, and nor should they. If a person was drowning, even if you were a lifeguard, you wouldn't have to save that person if it meant you would definitely drown. For some reason you were wearing a full suit of armor on your way to the Renaissance convention, you didn't have time to take it off, you wouldn't be required to jump into the water and save the person if it meant that you would certainly drown, because that should never be a cost you have to take. Not just the cost you have to definitely take, but a gamble. No one is expected to gamble for their lives to save other people. But thirdly, and this we would argue is most important, you don't owe a duty of care to protect people from harm when that harm was not your fault to begin with. A company might owe a real duty to compensate people for polluting a river if it polluted that river themselves. But we don't see why this duty should extend to a person that had nothing to do with the meteor coming to be or nothing to do with the potential harms. So given these three caveats are not met, we don't see why this individual owes a duty of care, and the burden falls on the side of the House to prove why they do. I'll give you a chance to do that now.
Yeah, okay. So, for example, let's say Donald Trump didn't create all the problems that exist in America, but doesn't he still have, because he can make the lives of human beings better, the VP?
Okay, no. He doesn't have it because he can make their lives better. It's because he chose to opt into an office that forces him to have that duty of care. He chose to be involved in the public life, and that's why, as a president, he owes the duty of care. Not simply by virtue of him having the ability. Otherwise, I would have to, go and make out with everybody because I'm excellent at giving head, but I don't have to. Now, let's talk about valuing life. It is very important that life be valued primarily on the basis of why it is valued. So on this side of the house, we say we've got to value life. But we offer you in OG no comparison as to why the lives of human beings are inherently more valuable than the lives of other conscious aliens that can also love and speak and talk presumably. So you recognize that the caveat in which you recognize the sanctity of life is premised upon this one word, consciousness, which entails your ability to feel pain, which then again presupposes the right to not feel pain. It entails your ability to self-actualize, which then presupposes the right to facilitate such actualization. Given the consciousness is presumably the same in human beings as it is in this alien species demonstrated by the ability to time travel, speak, and understand issues, he even had the courtesy to, guarantee your safety in the trip back. All of this means that there's no caveat as to why you should protect your own species. That's a primitive, nationalist, anti-globalist idea. We think all of our ideas about life have moved in the direction of protecting consciousness. To that respect, let's look at the expediency. Of course I have to do some mill, because the best expedient thing here is helping most life for the longest time. The scientist presumably extends their life and goes on to help the whole galaxy in a Rick and Morty sort of way. They might choose to go and look for Szechuan sauce for the next 9 seasons, but that's okay, because the personal choice of the scientist to continue living, to continue doing science, to continue meaningfully interacting, making love with aliens and creating alien babies and having Szechuan sauce is all in line with that ability, individual's ability to self-actualize in a different place. There is no reason why you should take that from this scientist or any other person.
Thank you for that speech. We now welcome the leader of the opposition.
On opposition, we couldn't care less if the probability of saving all the people on Earth was 0. In fact, we couldn't care less if the probability was negative, which is literally impossible. We think the hard line we are going to take consistently up and down this side of the house is that the whole point of what makes us human is sticking by those who have made our lives worth it. Even if the Earth is going to go out in a giant fiery blaze, the happiest place you could be in the world is right by their side. The debate you were supposed to hear was a very classical, battle of the titans between utilitarianism and deontology. And I don't think Nish ever explicitly used the word utilitarianism, probably on purpose. But I think the common theme from opening government was just about expediency and the greatest good broadly. If you can self-preserve and do other good things in the world, that matters more than the underlying moral premises that exist in the motion that we were supposed to talk about. So in doing that, the philosophy you're probably going to hear from opposition bench, opening and closing, is that there are certain moral procedures to how we interact with other people. Specifically, again, this whole thing about deontology. And we're going to take a really classic approach to this. There's this old dude named Kant. He created something called the categorical imperative. It's really simple, just 3 very basic rules about how to treat people. Haven't started yet. The first one is that in morality broadly, there is a component of universality, meaning that when you do something, you should also try to imagine a world in which everyone takes the same action as you. If that action is undesirable when everyone else does it, then you probably shouldn't engage in it. The second one is about means and ends, in that human beings are always the end. Everything you do must be in the name of humanity, and at the point at which you use humans as bargaining chips and you go to another planet to help other people because it's more convenient for you, you've intrinsically dehumanized an entire planet on opening government. And the third part of this, which doesn't make particularly much sense, is that you have to be a ruler in a kingdom of means, which no one really figured out, and Kant's dead, so we haven't had a response from him. So,
Here it is.
okay, fine.
So why do you privilege the consciousness of humanity over the consciousness of other aliens, given that all life ends in itself?
Well, that's the criticism I'm going to make of your case after I'm done with mine. So, having said that, the first point on universality, like what exactly is the universal principle that opening government is justifying by supporting the motion? I think you're justifying in a world in which you care less about other beings because there's a more comfortable option for you. Like, you're willing to go to another place to do good things because of an intrinsic selfishness, because you care about how you're going to die, and that's necessarily a bad thing. I think the world that opening government creates is a world where we only care about others if it makes us feel slightly loftier. Like, if there's no risk associated with helping others, then we might do it. But the world that opening government wants is one where we dehumanize others because of a selfish, materialistic need, rather than one that's based on love and camaraderie, the things that make us human at its core. The second point is about the means to an end thing, right? Based on some factor that humans have no control over, right? The supernova that the motion talks about, Nish just dehumanized an entire planet because they're near a catastrophe they didn't ask for. So apparently these people matter less because there's a supernova nearby. And I think, like, impactfully that doesn't make much sense, but if you were on the receiving end of this situation, think of it this way. There's a supernova near you, so you matter less fundamentally as a human being. I think like a more mundane comparison of this would be, let's say you're about to get hit by a bus, and Professor Miller is the only person who can save you. Professor Miller determines that the bus is far too close to you in his opinion, so he's just going to let you die. In your final moments, I don't think you feel too great about that. So with those two things being said, I want to move on to rebut a little bit of Nish's case before making like the final KO to it. So the first point he said is that there's basically the first couple arguments were really about the rights you have, like intellectual property, ownership of ideas, and all of this stuff couldn't be more irrelevant to the debate. The debate isn't about whether you have those rights. This is a moral debate about the exercise of the liberties you have. We're not arguing that you don't have rights to your ideas. We're asking ourselves in this entire round, how should you exercise the freedom over those ideas? Should you be selfish about it and ignore an entire planet, or despite having that liberty, should you act as a force for good and try to help them anyway, even if it means you perish? So the first three arguments don't particularly matter. Now his point on duty of care was that it's not your fault, so you should not be obliged to do anything. And I think like counterintuitively, this is like just a really pernicious argument. If I was hanging off a cliff, it's not your fault, but I still think a lot of people would try to save, not me particularly, but a human being, right? Because, again, like the thing that makes us human is that we have a general concern for each other regardless of the reason that we're in trouble, right? It doesn't matter if you caused the problem. The thing that makes you a good person is that you're willing to look past the circumstances that got us there because you intrinsically realize that we are all one and the same in many ways. And now the thing that Nish wanted me to talk about earlier with his POI is that why are humans more important than, say, aliens? One of the problems that a utilitarian, materialistic approach makes is that it has no concept of justice. You'll note that up and down the government bench, you're not actually going to hear any discussion of who deserves your help as a person, right? Even if it's an alien, even if it's a human being, the reason human beings are more valuable in this case is because not just the knowledge you have as a person, not just the means to create groundbreaking scientific experiments, not just those things were created by the people around you, but the love you were given as a child, right? Like that came from your family. The friendship you made through your entire life, that was given by people. Like there's an entire planet that works day in and day out to sustain everything you do, make sure you have a comfortable bed to sleep in at the end of the day, right? I think just by virtue of reciprocity, Earth has a much greater stake in your ability to do good things than a distant race of aliens far, far away who have never met you before. I think intuitively, that's the moral distinction you make between us and aliens. And one of the things that Joe is going to tell you, and this is going to be a really cool pragmatic point, and it's going to be cool particularly because it's one of those pragmatic points that's derived from a moral outcome, is that, let's say you go to this new planet, right? 7 billion people are dead because you chose to do nothing, right? Like, that's going to be a weight that's on your shoulders. Realistically, even if you help others, I think you're going to have to live with the fact that you chose to do nothing in the wake of destruction. Like, you're probably going to be extremely depressed unless you're some sort of godless heathen, right? And I think that's what Joe is going to tell you about. And that does carry a lot of weight in the real world. So the debate you're going to hear is, again, we understand that you have the liberty to do nothing. The question is, should you exercise the laziness that opening government is so proud of? Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Madam Speaker, we think you can tell from the language that Philip used throughout his speech that his side has a fundamentally old, archaic, and outdated understanding of what it means to respect life, right? Because when he talks to you about humanity and the harms of dehumanizing a particular population, we don't really understand what that means, right? We say that right now your conception of what valuable life should be and the types of individuals that you should value and try to protect aren't limited or valued because of their ostensible humanity, right? Because of the genes within their genome that make them a human being, but by their ability to think freely, their ability to express consciousness, and their ability to express those ideas in a way that benefits their society, regardless of whether it's a human one or not. That's the fundamental problem with all of Philip's analysis, which really boils down to the people you should choose to focus most of your efforts on helping are the people that look ostensibly most like you, even if you don't know all of them and you don't know the kinds of life forms that are the alternative population. That is fundamentally his argument, no matter how he tries to spin it and tell it to you. So I'm going to talk about three things in my speech that summarize the clash between our two cases. We think that the points in this debate that are going to stand out and be important towards the end have already been revealed. So what I'm going to talk about first of all is intellectual property, why that was an important part of our case, and how that extends into your ability to protect yourself even when you might have an obligation to save other people, right? The assertion by Philip that we didn't engage in a principled debate was ludicrous. The second thing that I'm going to talk about then is why we respect and value certain forms of life, and when we place certain forms of life over others, whether that's okay or not. And finally, I'm going to talk about this particular, like Elon's effectiveness in an alien society, whether or not the weight of the death of human civilization is going to weigh on him and impede his ability to be a scientist. Before any of that, though, we think it's fundamentally important to reestablish what we thought was quite a clear weighing criteria for this debate. Because, quite often, it's the case that principled matters and practical ones can't be separated, particularly when you're talking about human life. Because we think that preservation of human life in and of itself is a moral goal that requires, practical strategizing in order to achieve. So the mechanism that we gave you for weighing this entire round was the side that has the best chance of helping the most life over the longest period of time. So without any further ado, let's move into those 3 points. So first, intellectual property and your right to protect yourself. This includes all of the arguments about duty of care. The simplest way that duty of care has often been thought about is through a thought experiment about, an individual who's drowning in a pond and whether or not you, as a passerby, have an obligation to save them. Nish gave you very cogent analysis and criteria as to when we believe, because we do believe there is a duty of care, but we believe that there are obvious caveats and limitations that mean that not every individual has to jeopardize everything about their life always to improve anything about other people's lives, right? You obviously have to take into consideration a few things. So Nish told you that you had to take into consideration your capacity to help, the evaluation of the risk to yourself, and whether or not you can actually protect those people from harm. What was the response we heard from Philip? We don't think we really did hear one beyond Joe's POI about why obligation can exist in the form of the president, and we think that was defeated fairly soundly in 10 seconds by Nish when he told you that that's an elected position. So what did we hear then, right? The essential analysis behind your obligation to humanity. We heard that because you have community and because you know these people and they're of your race, you have more of an obligation, more of a duty of care to deal with those people. We don't understand why or at what level that engages with our analysis about capacity, and we don't understand like particularly his example about being run over by a bus at the point where Professor Miller could have saved him, walks into like this analysis of morality, because we wouldn't have expected Professor Miller to save him in that instance, because he wasn't trained and doesn't have the capacity to do so. The potential for greater harm, right? The potential in the long term for harm is that there's a huge likelihood that Professor Miller is going to get himself killed as well. So at the point where Philip is in front of a bus, we think that is unfortunate, but that doesn't in any moral sense give anyone else a duty of care to go and protect him. We still think that Joe needs to deal with first speaker's analysis. What then was the next thing he told you about deontology and Kant, right? He told you that it's important that and it's ironic that he uses the notion of universality, right? Talking about specifically not protecting individuals in the universe and protecting people on Earth. He says that an important component of morality is that you should expect anyone else to take the same actions were they in your circumstance. And we say we do expect any individual, any human being, if they were targeted by this alien, to take this course of action. And the fundamental reason that it ties into that analysis about duty of care is about capacity to help, right? It is very clear that even though this Elon character is one of the most eminent scientific minds on the planet, there is an almost zero chance of being able to save 7 billion people. So at the point where practicality and morality are inherently tied together, we tell you that consideration of whether those moral outcomes are possible is important in this case. Moving on then to talk about why we respect certain forms of life, and I'll take back up.
Yeah, so the fundamental problem with your case is that you try to apply a principle to essentially quantifying the value of life. We don't think that that's principally consistent at all with any principle, and we don't think that you could win when you have a duty to a collective over your own individual rights.
Yeah, so this is kind of addressed here, because like our case isn't that you don't have a duty to a collective, but it's that duty to, at the point where it's between two different kinds of collectives, how do we evaluate those, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. The point of that first argument was to say there are instances where we limit absolute duty to other people, and we say that this scientist has fulfilled those kinds of obligations to not necessarily commit to saving humanity. So why do we value certain forms of life? And the way I'm going to talk about this argument is first of all the way that it's progressed in terms of humans versus animals and the debate that we see in our own society, and second, how the human versus human debate has progressed as well. So the primary difference and the reason we respect human life in a huge number of instances over forms of animal life is because we understand that there's an element of consciousness that humans possess that animals don't. What specifically does that mean? We think that means, and it encompasses things like the ability to picture yourself as like an agent in the world, to objectively think of your interactions with other beings, and to picture other beings as conscious agents who also react to your own actions, right? So we think that there was, like, for a long time in the history of colonialism and the history of humanity, there were arbitrary distinctions drawn between forms of human life based on ostensible characteristics that devalued a particular form of life because it said that they weren't as conscious, weren't as human, weren't as valuable in terms of their livelihood. And we say that that's been proven to be fundamentally false. So we don't see why that logic, that two human beings who look different should be valued the same, not because of their differences, but because they have a capacity to think and a capacity to create ideas, means that the billions of aliens that you are certainly going to help if you guarantee your survival, why are those lives less important than the billions of human lives that, while important, are extremely unlikely to be saved, right? That was the fundamental point of our analysis on why we value life. The end of that analysis given to you by opening government is that there's no reason to devalue alien life, because let's be very clear here. By making the choice to not leave Earth, you are also condemning billions of aliens to a worse life than they would have had if you, as that scientist, had gone to their communities. So you are creating harms there. And, like, for what?